So thank you very much, Neil. It's lovely to be invited along today. It's nice to meet all of you and get those little descriptions. That is helpful. So yes, I am Lynn Elvins. I'm one of the AGP advisors, but I work as what's called a design manager. So one of the things that people then get slightly confused, I have design in my description. So people then say, well, you're a designer. So what do you design? And of course, I don't actually design anything. I talk about design as in terms of innovation and leadership. And then I talk to businesses about how they do the whole range of design across their organizations. So positioning brands, developing products, delivering services. I talk to them about the sort of strategic positioning of all of those things before they start getting the designers in. So one of the problems, design is such a broad topic that one of the problems, particularly for smaller companies, is what type of designer do I need to get in? And they can get a little bit lost amongst the design industry. So that's one of the things I help companies do. And again, obviously, all of that discussion then overlaps with your business strategy and your marketing and sales. So that's why I then talk to companies about their strategies rather than talking to sort of people about graphics or logos or things like that. And in terms of sustainability, before I started working for small businesses, I worked with several consultancies in London, and we used to work with large companies and talk to them about their sustainability strategies. And again, my focus then was in being interested in brands and communication and product development for innovation. And I've also co-created a tool specifically for designers to, again, just be able to break down this kind of massive topic of sustainability and how do you pick off pieces of it in a way that you can sort of have a strategy rather than kind of getting overwhelmed with it all. So today, the description for today's talk was this one. But again, just to sort of reiterate, I'm focusing on the kind of more the environmental sustainability today. Sustainability has the social side in it as well. And obviously, as a term, having a sustainable business is also thrown around a lot, just meaning keeping going financially. And again, for me, I find that an interesting sort of way in which that term sustainable business is very, very common. But I'm going to focus today around is environmental sustainability. And again, it's not new. It's been around. I'm sure all of you are doing various aspects of it already. But it's an interesting time at the moment because some of those pressures are increasing. Government interest has come up. It's higher on the agenda again, which is great. And the kind of pressure from customers is also quite strong at the moment, which is very interesting. So my question actually for any company that's manufacturing or selling products, the question is do you have a plan, and do you kind of know which areas of your product are the ones that you need to be looking at? So that's what we're going to kind of run through. It's just 30 minutes. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. And again, because I didn't know who was going to be in the room, it's a kind of top level look at these kind of areas of, how do you start navigating a strategic position? Touch on circular design, because that's one of the very sort of prevalent phrases at the moment. Prioritizing materials, using the big corporates to kind of get a steer on where you might go, and also the all-important area of communications, which again, in sustainability terms, can be a bit of a minefield. So it does need a bit of a strategy behind it. And then what I've done with each of these action points, or points rather, is I've suggested an action that any of you could then take away from each one and go and do within your business. And they also focus on the sorts of conversations that I might facilitate with companies when I first go in and work with them. So first one, navigating a strategic position. In terms of business drivers for sustainability, there are many. There's all different ways and reasons why companies get into this. And they range from the regulatory requirements of just meeting increasing levels of environmental legislation, all the way through, and this list kind of goes, down that initial starting point, all the way through into there are possibilities for price premiums in some markets. It gets into reputation and brand. And then for me, in a way where it gets really exciting is when companies can look at new markets and innovation. And obviously then the very long-term sustainability of businesses and how you look at potentially new business models and really thinking that long-term stuff. Now, one of the things which I don't put on this list, or people maybe expect me to put on this list, is like, well, we do it because we want to save the planet. That is not, I'm not doing a presentation today on, all of the upward graphs that are going on with climate change and the rest of it to sort of make a case for why businesses should be saving the planet. To me, all of this stuff is good business practice in the 21st century. It isn't some sort of, hippie agenda or environmentalist agenda. I think it's very exciting. I think it involves a lot of change, but it is just good business practice. But of course, one of the groups of people these days who are talking about that we need to save the planet, we need to do these things urgently, is at the moment this whole kind of, Greta Thunberg and the younger generations who are calling for more of this, and say this is, very of its time. This is sort of, we've seen this kind of ramp up in the last 3-5 years. Again, for me, I think this is very exciting. I think this sort of, it's slightly an aggressive tone almost. It causes friction. I think that's good. I think that means we have to have some of these quite difficult conversations. But obviously for you running businesses, this then means if you are dealing with young people, if you have kids at home, if your customers are of a younger generation, you will be dealing with this. And these people are coming through into business. So it does have an impact and it's there. But again, for me, this is exciting. This is part of what's going on at the moment. And it's not separate to business. It has an impact. But of course, when you're in those big subjects, this is one of the initial complications of dealing with sustainability, because you've got all of these issues going on. And frankly, whether you look at climate change or population growth or pollution, consumption, seaspiracy with the seafood industry at the moment, all of that stuff, if you go towards those subjects and pick up those books or read, watch the documentaries like Seaspiracy, you will know all of that stuff is not happy reading. It is a lot of doom and gloom. It's a lot of scary stuff. And actually, this is one of the reasons why some people find sustainability just quite a scary topic to go into. I think it's interesting and it's exciting and it's very much aligned with businesses and things that we can do positively. But there are lots of people who find it full of fear, actually, and then find it a difficult subject to kind of deal with. And at this big scale as well, for businesses, this is the stuff that you'll read in the newspapers and see on the TV. This is where you will start getting into big politics as well. And so I also find with small business people, they can tend to be a bit nervous about going towards that as suddenly, we're getting involved in a political discussion. And that's not what we kind of necessarily feel we want to do. But at the other end, which is where it also gets complicated, sustainability is full of very small stuff, and we touch it in very small ways individually in our lives. So we do our recycling at home. Again, the more recent discussions are things like straws. We're not using straws in our drinks now, and that's a new one, and single-use plastics. For many years, we've been talking about turning lights off and saving energy and things like that. So again, these come thick and fast and they change all the time, which is where some people get a little bit like, I'm confused. I don't know what we're supposed to be doing. The other aspect to this small stuff is that sometimes the tone of this is about what we all need to stop doing. So it feels a little bit finger waggy, it can do, and it can make people actually feel a bit guilty and a bit concerned. So again, it fills this whole area. Sometimes if you're talking to your employees or your own families or your colleagues, it's a little bit like, well, we don't quite know what to do about it. And it all feels a bit negative and a bit big and a bit overwhelming. So strategically for businesses, the first thing to think about is to work in context. So you don't have to be responsible for all the massive global issues at that worldview. But equally, how you deal with sustainability things at home, doing your recycling as an individual, and also as your employees as individuals, that is a different agenda. That's all very good, but it's separate. When I'm talking to a company, I'm interested, again, particularly with small businesses, what is your sphere of influence as a small business? And obviously all of you come from different sectors, different types of products. So that's the first context to stay within. But you will then have business relations often with larger companies or with supply chains. So again, what is going on in that context? What are the issues and subjects in that area? Who are your suppliers talking with? One of the people today mentioned, you're going into Morrison's. So again, my question would be well, what are Morrison's doing in this area? And what might they be expecting of you as a supplier to Morrison's? And again, your customers. How are they seeing it? Where are their attitudes? What are their preferences and priorities? And that is a genuine, area to then look at. But this is one way just to bring it down into your sphere of influence as a small business. But we are then connected. We are in this context of these big global issues. And one way for any business then to, not get overwhelmed by those, but also to remain strategically kind of anchored to them, is to use the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, but the latest tranche, they've been around longer. They were originally the Millennium Development Goals, and they've continued, again, being created by the United Nations. So the latest iteration was all signed in 2015. And again, it's got a long-term view. The next goal that they're heading towards is 2030. But what the United Nations has done has broken down all of the big kind of global aspects into 16 different areas. And then the 17th one pushes the fact that they should all be joined up and everyone should be partnering to work together. They are all joined, but also it is recognised in business that many big businesses who use them, and lots of big businesses do use them as a framework, they start by prioritising 3. So it's a way in, again, not to have to try and tackle all of them. The reason why I mention the Sustainable Development Goals as well as a framework is that you don't need to pay someone to come in and audit you if you want to sign up to them. You can just go along. There are many other frameworks. I think one of you mentioned becoming a B Corp. If you want to become a B Corp, that's another great system at the moment. It's very popular with smaller companies. You will have to pay to get B Corp certification. You don't need to pay anything if you just want to investigate the Sustainable Development Goals, look at them. There is lots of incredibly deep information, depending on how deep you want to go, but it's all free online and you can go in and look at it. The United Nations do that because they want all of this to go out as widely as possible. You can pay people to come in and help you with it, but as I say, there's a lot that can be done by just looking at it, and there's a lot of free information out there. So the first action on this one I would suggest to you is, if you haven't looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, or you haven't already chosen a framework, do have a look at them. Potentially get your team together, your management team or your entire team, and look at them together and choose your top 3 priorities and work out why. Why are you connected to those? How does that affect you? And that can start to inform the sort of widest strategy for what you want to then do. So the second one, again, I'm sure some of you are familiar with circular design. So the issue here, and again, each product is always very, very different. I've chosen 2 products just to put as an illustration, one being a chair because it's a relatively simple product in terms of materials, and then a more complicated electronic product. So it's a solar charging unit. So it's just a very, very different. And again, all products are very different. Energy using products in particular have an entirely different kind of footprint to static products that don't use energy in that way, and we're not plugging them in. But when with a product, the main thing is to start with this idea of life cycle thinking. So rather than just starting with, here is my product, this is how I see it in my warehouse or in my production facility, it's actually going downstream, as I would call it. Where has this thing come from? And not just the object itself, but all its components. Where did it get shipped from? All of the raw materials, everything, how it started in its life. Go and look there and think about it. And this is what life cycle thinking asks you to do. And then go to the other end of actually, once you've sold it, where's it going to go? What's going to happen to it? How long is it going to last? Is it going to be thrown away? Will you get it back, which is increasingly happening with products? Is there a secondhand market? All of those things. And again, there will be different scenarios for different types of products. Some products stay being kept by customers for decades, and others move very, very quickly through cycles. But it's thinking about all of those things, and that's what life cycle thinking is asking you to do. Design is incredibly important in life cycle thinking, because if you want to change a product in terms of how it's made and how it's sourced, and more importantly, where it's going to go, actually, if you want to do something about that, you need to build it in when you design it, so that you can actually, ideally, stop anything going into landfill. That's ultimately the basic principle. We shouldn't just be taking stuff out of the Earth's resources, making what we want, and then kind of handing it over, and it just ends up in landfill. That is now seen as an old way of thinking. We need to keep things looping around. And this then is where the language of the circular economy has come from. And so this is the more recent term that's used. If you're interested in the circular economy, again, the main organisation that are big champions of this is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And they have fantastic programmes on circular design. And again, huge amounts of resources that are free. Lots of webinars, lots of training programmes. You can become part of their network, lots of case studies and all that sort of stuff. So if you want more information about circular design, head on over to them, and there's an awful lot to be had. So for you, an action on circular design is, again, put your product in the middle. Have you sat down with your team and actually said, actually, where's all this stuff coming from? And you can include your packaging in that. And again, where is it all going? For the person, I think it's Anthony, you're a gift importer. Again, you're not manufacturing things then, but that's an interesting challenge of where all those gifts are going to end up. To me, straight away, I would think that's quite a complicated scenario if you wanted to try and take responsibility for where all those things go, and how you might maybe look into that. So again, spend some time with your team and just go back and see, what do you know and what don't you know? That's the first stage to just work out with your teams. So number 3, prioritizing materials. Again, similar sort of principle. So I've stuck with the same 2 example products, but here we then want to just focus specifically on the materials. So again, first question, if you start looking at them, that I would want to start saying to companies is, well, how many different materials have you got? Again, where are they coming from? So some of the overlaps just in looking at the whole life cycle. But in terms of creating priorities, some of then the ways you can cut it is, first of all, well, which is your largest kind of material? So obviously, if we look at something like a chair that's made out of timber, then the timber is just the largest quantity material. So that would be a good reason to say, actually, perhaps we should start there with just the biggest. But you can sometimes also get products or materials that you just know at the moment are actually just problematic. So plastics obviously is getting a lot of attention. So there might be plastic material within your product. And because of the urgency over plastic, you might say, well, let's actually prioritize that one and see if we've got some alternatives or different types of plastics that we might use. Again, sometimes though, it's not about the quantity, it's actually about something that's quite small, but you might have a specific issue. So is there a little thing? And again, if I use the chair as an example, the chair is mostly timber, but there might be glues and aspects like that that are very small in terms of proportion. But the question is actually those glues might be particularly problematic depending on how they're made and where they're coming from. They might involve, rare or toxic or hazardous materials. So that might be a reason to prioritize them. And again, if you're doing this with your teams, the other thing that you have to face up to is there will be some stuff that's just easier to tackle. And I'm all for companies going for some quick wins. If there's some quick wins there, that's fine. Stick them at the top of the list and get moving. But don't do that to the detriment of ignoring potentially the real tough challenge. And that might be where a bigger source of innovation is. So always have different things going on. And as an example, quite some years ago now, I worked with ICI paints, and we looked at paints. And again, we took them through big life cycle exercise and went across everything from the chemicals that came into paints to their manufacturing sites over in Slough, to how they were then sold and packaged, and how they were then used on large kind of construction sites. And across the entire life cycle, we actually came up with 9 individual projects. So it's not just a one-hit wonder. You can't just tackle sustainability in one little checklist. That you had to sort of deep dive into the 9 priority areas that we did with them. And for example, water is the biggest component in paint. It's nearly 90% of a paint pot. So one of the projects we looked at is, well, let's see if we can take the water out. If you take the water out, you take the weight out, it's all sorts of interesting stuff. The chemists that we worked at, though, with ICI paints, they know that some of the chemicals that go into pigments or specific stabilizers, they know their stuff. They know that some of them are potentially problematic, or they're very rare. So one of the exercises was for them to sort of look into some of those. And again, at the other end, we looked at the packaging, plastic paint pots, metal paint pots, where they were ending up, and all of those recycling areas. So there's all sorts of ways that you should end up with even a single product, probably a whole list of a number of projects to look into. So again, on this one, the action, again, put your product in the middle. How much do you know about the materials? What have you done about it? Its component parts, again, what's going on? What have you got in there? And how might you start picking off some of those quick wins? Or what is your biggest, toughest challenge? And can you sort of do that with your team and look at it? Number 4, take a steer from the big companies. In any sector you can care to look at, the big companies, because of their size, because of their scale, they are really in the thick of conversations with governments and looking at their global responsibilities. I am not suggesting that corporate companies have got all of this sewn up. Some of them clearly are better than others. Some of them are not doing enough, but some of them are doing an awful lot, and they can actually be involved in a surprising amount if you are not used to going and looking at, say, corporate reports on sustainability. So again, I've just picked these 6 as examples, but obviously, IKEA's in furniture, Saint-Gobain are in construction and automotive, Philips are in electronics, Unilever's all over food, Nike's in sport, Patagonia is there working in clothing, outdoor wear clothing. So all of these companies are already doing stuff, and they've all got teams looking at this stuff. So you yourself, as a smaller company, you don't need to start from a blank slate. Go and look at what the big companies are doing, because they've already done some of their strategic work, and that might actually help you when you come to work for your priorities. So just as a few examples, so Patagonia. Patagonia are a real champion in sustainability. And again, you can see why, because they sell outdoor clothing to people who like the outdoors. They like the environment. They like nature. They would be foolish, really, to sort of not deal with this, even if they did it for brand reputation and sales alone. But they are very big champions in this area. They do all sorts of stuff. But if you go to their website, you can see, again, in great detail, they have all of these articles and more of every single material that they deal with. So here you can see where they break down. If you want to know about their polyester, about how they recycle, use their rubber, their down, say all of these sorts of things, they cover it. And again, they've got a sort of 30-strong team that work on this for them. And for them, again, the environment is a quality issue. It is not an add-on, it is not an extra, it is embedded in the quality of their products. But at the other end, again, with reference to life cycle thinking, one of their more recent initiatives is that now you can send back a piece of Patagonia clothing once you are finished with it. You can get it back to them. They will repair, they will refurb, and they will create a secondhand market. And you can now buy secondhand Patagonia clothes through them. They will also encourage you to repair your own, which again, in business terms, is a potentially surprising attitude to take. And they do talk about the fact that consumption is one of the things we need to reduce. And this is a company producing products and selling products. But to me, this is the level now of the sort of, these are big discussions about what companies are doing and how they're addressing big issues like consumption. And to say the champions of it are happy to have those discussions. These are quite grown up, sort of intelligent conversations to deal with. And I love it, again, when you get companies sort of having these. If we swap over to Philips, so obviously in electronics, Philips, again, have been a real champion in this area. They've been working in it since the 90s. But again, Philips, Philips is not a green company. They're not a niche. They're not some sort of eco niche company. They are a mainstream brand. On their website, again, you will see that they are using this more recent language of ESG, which in corporate speak is now environmental, social, and corporate governance. That is the latest kind of phrasing that they're talking about. But here you can see as well, Philips have chosen their top 3 sustainable development goals, and they are talking about them. So they are using that framework, and this is an example of that. And again, if you go in more details in their website, they've been big pioneers of eco-design. Again, eco-design is an older term, but because they were doing it in the 90s when eco-design was the term, they still refer to eco-design. And again, they talk freely about life cycle assessments and how they do that. And they then break down this whole area, again, into these 5 topics, which they focus on. So energy use, packaging, substances, again, which is about those little potentially kind of harmful hidden substances that might be in a product, weight and materials, which is when you get into bulk and things like that, and again, shipping and carbon and all of those related issues. And again, the 5th one that they've got, circularity. So they are also then talking about the circular economy. So you can start to see how all of these sort of bits of language and strategic areas do all start to overlap and get talked about within companies. And if you didn't realize it, and you might be, people, when I show this to them, are often sort of surprised, but every single Philips product has what they call an eco passport. So you can look into each product. They then will give you a summary as a consumer. If you want to see them, again, you can go online and get them. How does each product be covered against each of those areas that they're going into? Again, do they meet particular standards, particular regulations? And it's all there in a very simplified way that a customer could understand. And they share this across their entire company as part of their whole kind of strategy. So the action for you, again, depending on which sector that you're in, I would suggest that, again, you find yourself a relevant large company and go and have a look at what they're doing. Dig around. You might find the details in the kind of about us section or their corporate section. You might find it under sustainability. You might find it under environmental commitment. You might find it under corporate social responsibility or ESG. So you might need to do a little bit of digging, but you will find public information. All big companies have stuff on this now. So I say, if it's in your sector, the way that it can help you, it's not that you need to mimic what they're doing, but they have already done a lot of the thinking. So have a look at what they're doing, and that can help you just come into the space that may be relevant for your business. And lastly, we have communications, again, which is, I'm very keen that you should be communicating, but again, you've got to have a strategy behind your communications. So we're coming back to, again, think of that in context. So you are then focusing on your company communications, but if you are communicating up your chain into in your supply chain to other related companies, you might have to communicate some very technical detail. Or again, it will be about your regulatory requirements or your procurement policies and things like that. So you're talking about a very specific type of language, and it's much more like company corporate reporting, but it's important and it needs to be done if that's who your priority kind of audience is for your communications. Within your own positioning, if you like, your own tone, before you start communicating, check your competitors and see what they're doing. Because the reality is they may be doing better than you. They may have been doing this for longer, but they might not. They might not be doing anything. But do check that because you want to position yourselves realistically about what within what else is going on in your say in your market alongside your competitors. Don't just run out there saying that you're the best at this and you're fantastic because you're super pleased about what you're doing, because you may just find that you run into a bit of a brick wall and hit a competitor who actually has been doing this stuff a lot longer and a lot better than you, and that may come back and kind of fly in your face. Again, if you want to communicate with customers, then you take a steer from where they are and what they're ready to hear, and what other context that they are seeing these issues in. But again, if you're going to talk to customers, then you've got to take this stuff through your brand and your marketing. So you are then talking about getting it down to much simpler messages and ones that are toned in the right way, that they do fit with your overall brand positioning. And again, that's about putting them on your website, getting them on pack, and all that sort of other types of communication, as well as, I say, the details. And then last but not least in this one, with your employees, communicate with them about what you're doing. It's a great way to get them involved. They potentially, again, they may have differing views on these things across your employees, but they may have kids. They may be going to climate change marches on the weekend. You know, they may be really, really interested, and they increasingly are. So you can get them involved and engaged with this conversation about what you're doing. And also, as been shown many times before, because of it is a very strong interest, particularly with the younger generation, when you are recruiting particularly younger people, this is now an area that new recruits will look at to find out, do I want to work with this company? What is this company doing in terms of the environment and also social responsibility? So again, work out who is your audience for your communications, and just think about the messages that you want to take through. Again, in terms of communications, I've always touched on, you know, it's not that you have to somehow then start claiming that you're going to, you know, single-handedly start saving the planet, but it is important to share what you're doing, and in a confident way, and to celebrate it, to be proud of it. But, you know, do take an appropriate tone. So obviously what we want to avoid is any company getting involved in the equivalent of greenwashing. So you may have just done something that you think, you know, was quite tricky and was a fantastic first step. But again, you might want to just be careful that you don't over-egg it publicly. Say there can be a danger that you can get a bit of a backlash if you don't handle the communications with the appropriate tone. And sometimes that does involve a little bit of humility if you've just started doing these things. But again, in order to have a strategy, you know, do be clear about the big issues that you're aligning with and why. And that's where things like the Sustainable Development Goals come in very handy as a way to sort of pick those off and to give them some context. Do talk about the actions that you are taking. So not just the ideas or the intentions that you've got, but what are you actually doing? And again, if you think back to companies like Patagonia, you know, get specific. Give some numbers, get into the details of that so that you share that side and that you're transparent with what you're actually doing. You might have percentage targets or goals or things like that. Share them as stories. You know, we all like stories. And again, that works very well for sort of brand communications. And explain to people that you are on these journeys. You don't have to be perfect before you start sharing public information. It is okay that these things shift and change all the time. And that is partly because we're constantly finding out new information about what needs to be done. And that is the nature of sustainability. We are learning it, but say for me, that's where it is exciting. And again, always be ready. You might have done something, but what are you going to do next? On that sort of never-ending journey of looking at using sustainability within your company, you know, what are you going to do? Where is the next area of kind of continuous improvement? And that's also something that you can be open and transparent about, again, with your employees or, you know, publicly with your customers, and also investigating with the support of your suppliers. You know, sometimes you can partner with those people to actually get stuff in place. And the action on this one, I always like a sort of what if scenario. And I would say to you, yeah, just again, have a little think. What if a local journalist phoned you up and said, what's your company doing on environmental sustainability? What would be your answer? Would you be suddenly, would that make you very nervous and you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what we would say? Or are you ready for something like that? Would you have, again, an intelligent and confident position on what you're doing, as well as potentially what you've not yet done, so that you can talk publicly? I say it's not about being perfect, but that you have an overall position that would be positive and confident about your business and how you're moving forward on these issues. So again, yeah, have a little think about that and see, try with your teams and see what comes up. So to summarize, the 5 key steps that we've run through very, very quickly. So do have a strategic position and relate what you're doing to the big issues, and say the Sustainable Development Goals are a great way to do that. Get into the circular design kind of mindset. So don't just think about the product in front of you and how you see it. Think about, where did it get made? Where, how, where does it all come from? And where will it end up? And they are very interesting areas, particularly for innovation, if you want to rethink your products. Prioritize your materials. Again, it might be the bulky, it might be the little problematic one. You look at alternatives. There's all sorts of interesting stuff there. Take a steer from the big companies. You don't have to start from a blank sheet. There are other businesses out there who've already tackled this stuff. So, learn from them as a starting point, and do communicate what you're doing. But remember just to communicate appropriately, whether that's with your suppliers or your customers or your employees. Have a little communication strategy about it. And so that, in a nutshell, is then, say, 5 whirlwind steps, which I hope has given you all some things to go away and think about. And at that point, Neil, I think I will hand back over to you. I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Great, Lynn, thank you. That was fantastic, and absolutely great in terms of just it can feel such an overwhelming topic, and I know it's conversations that we've had in my business because we do e-commerce, so we sell stuff online. So we have this conversation regularly, but it just feels so overwhelming and so big, and it's really nice to have like those handful of like very actionable things. I mean, that thing around picking some of the sustainable development goals is brilliant, because it just feels then there's some stuff that you can manage. Because by the way, if you have any questions, please bung them in the chat. I've got a few questions I'm going to ask Lynn now, but please go ahead and type them and I'll relay them to Lynn. But yeah, so I think it can feel very overwhelming, and certainly do you have any thoughts on how not to be, or how to better be strategic and not reactionary? Because I think, it's quite interesting. I've been a vegetarian for 25 years or something ridiculous. And it's only really recently, or relatively recently, that I'm able to be smug about its improved environmental impact, right? When I first decided to do it, it was about animal welfare. This was back in sort of 90s. And, I keep seeing Seaspiracy pop up on my recommended thing on Netflix, but then also read some criticism of that, but it's not particularly scientific, or some elements aren't scientific. And that's something that, so how do you, and the whole thing about, I get angry, not angry, but I get frustrated when, we all feel guilt tripped into not using straws or making sure we recycle everything. And the reality is, we all know that actually, on a consumer level, it's policy and it's corporate changes, industrial changes that actually have them. How do we make better decisions as companies that aren't just driven by what is on the front page of the Guardian that week and what feels to be the hobby horse du jour?
Yeah. But again, I think the first way to anchor yourself in everything that then changes is to have your own strategy. So is to be aware of what's going on with your own products. So if you're producing, if you're selling seafood, then obviously, you need to have a heads up, and you should, you shouldn't be just taking your steer from what's going on in the papers. You actually should know your industry and know the players who are talking about these things. But then when a public issue does get raised, you do have to be ready to have a position on it. And, and that's just the nature of, kind of PR and news, as it changes all the time. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, though. It is one of the issues that when I speak to companies, they do get very confused by and fearful of, because it's like, well, where do we start? You know, do we just do the one that's kind of flavor of the month at the moment? But what if that changes? And what if everyone then, you know, doesn't, it moves on to something else, or there's suddenly there's a backlash, and we're sort of trying, and then we're being caught on the back foot. But to me, that's where I would say that means you haven't got a strategy. You're just reacting, which is why you need to get a strategy, and you need to get ahead of it. So if a journalist phones you up and says, well, why aren't you doing this? You should be able to confidently go, well, actually, we haven't reacted initially to that, because we know that our biggest impact is actually over here. Yeah. And that's what we focus on. But we welcome the introduction of a new, interest in the public, but it's okay, but we do this stuff here, so that you don't just get caught out. But it is, then that's why it's so important to have a strategy and to know your own impacts, and to be honest about your own impacts, rather than just get caught out by the latest.
And I think that that sort of action point you said about, you know, if a journalist phoned up, and I was like sweating while I was thinking about that. I was like, God, if a journalist phoned me up, I would give the most wishy-washy, muddled, badly thought through answer possible that would assuage my guilt, my liberal guilt that I'm actually thinking about it, but actually would very, very clearly highlight we don't have a strategy on this stuff. So I thought that was really powerful. And it brings us on to a point that Fidel has asked in the chat here about sort of greenwashing, because I think it's very easy to just jump to the topic du jour, right? And that's probably a symptom of greenwashing. So he's asked, if you check a company for their products or collaborations, are there any hints on when what they do that doesn't really work for sustainability, but it's just like a faking it? You know, what are the hints and signs of people who are just doing that greenwashing rather than really committing to it? Because obviously I really liked your point about modeling, you know, taking a sort of a hero company and go, right, these are the people that do it well, let's model our behavior on there, rather than, you know, because to think it through can be overwhelming, right? But also what you don't want to do is what Fidel's pointing to, is like suddenly find out a couple of months down the line that these people are fakers and they're just greenwashing, right? So how do we work that out?
Again, you know, it depends where your position is. So for some people, regardless of what a big corporate does, they don't like big corporates. And, you know, there's a discussion to be had globally about the role of big corporates. And if you just think that big corporates are part of the problem, regardless of what they try and do within their business, then in some respects, some people will say every corporate is just greenwashing. They're all just,
big capitalism is bad.
Yeah, and if you're an anti-capitalist and you're a real deep green activist, you potentially boycott big companies. So some people would say, you know, regardless of what, I'll pick on McDonald's again, you know, as one of the, you know, companies. But, you know, if you don't like McDonald's, there's nothing that McDonald's could say to you that potentially would sway that, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. You say I'm not. You know, people are entitled. There's a spectrum of views on sustainability because it's such a massive topic. But on the other hand, if we, I don't know the details of McDonald's, but again, I do know you'll be surprised how much McDonald's does on these subjects. You know, McDonald's do know the discussions about beef and rainforest clearance and all of that sort of stuff. If you go to McDonald's website, you will find a corporate report that is probably 80 plus pages long. You will, and part of, if you then consider it, but a company like McDonald's is so big that they are being scrutinized by other people. They will have campaign groups that are looking at them. One of the consultants that I used to work for in London, our job, we used to go in and effectively audit companies' reports, and we used to produce a ranking each year of whether or not the reports were any good, whether they were robust, whether or not they were, again, open to scrutiny, or whether it was just a load of fluff and it was just a lot of, you know, PR speak. So there are ways that you can dive in, but if you want to go to that level, you do, of course, have to do a bit more homework.
Sure.
But it's.
So I suppose there's stuff around certification, but also whether those certificates are valid and whatever. But yeah, I think you're Yes, it just requires that the bit of a deep dive and be committed to spending the time looking at yeah, the depth of what they're doing, rather is it just a headline and, you know, but is there anything to back it up?
Yeah, and you mentioned, you know, labeling schemes as well, and labeling, particularly on consumer products, labeling schemes in itself, we could do a whole discussion on those. There are some that are totally meaningless, and yet if you're not an informed consumer, you would take them as being legitimate.
Yeah.
And there are others that are, you know, much more deeply scrutinised. But even in the ones that are recognised and certified, there are people who still would argue that they don't go far enough. And it's a tricky industry. If you want to get a mainstream businesses on board, you can't necessarily raise the bar too high, because nobody would get on board and would do the certification. So, you know, things like FSC for paper and timber products, for example, you know, it is the mainstream one in that sector, but there are people who criticize it and say it doesn't go far enough. And it's only, you know, it's too mainstream, and it maybe needs, you know, revising and all that sort of stuff. So that's the other aspect. There is no fixed. Sustainability is not black and white. This is what is good and this is what is bad. It is a moving feast, and it depends where your position is on it. But that's why, to me, it's important that you just need to feel confident enough within your own business that you've looked and you've weighed things up, and then you've had a strategy, and at least you're trying and you can defend what you're doing, and that, yeah, you haven't just picked the easiest thing, stuck out a PR notice, and you're kind of going, oh, that would be fine because no one really cares. To me, that's not very robust.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that Fidel, I suppose, is talking about. Is like, actually, it wouldn't take too much digging to find out that that's all you're doing, because it's really just not that. There's nothing to back that up. A couple of very quick things then. Sophia has asked if your slide deck will be available afterwards. Will we be able to do that?
Sure. Yes, I'm very happy to send you
Brilliant.
over.
Okay, so once you've filled in your AG3s, Lisa, my colleague, will send those back to you. Does anybody last call for questions? I'm going to put in the chat now. If you're not receiving weekly updates on these upcoming events, you can sign up for the weekly updates here. And also a link as well to the upcoming events. As I mentioned, we have a great event coming up on boards, sort of advisory boards, non-exec boards, and also a project planning event, which I know that I need to be better at. Project management and project planning is something that I think I'm good at, but in retrospect, I'm not. And I kind of try and hide it by sounding like I know what I'm talking about. So if nobody has any further questions, one thing I will do actually is I will share Lynn and my contact details again. So should you want to have that 15-minute one-to-one with Lynn, which hopefully you will take up, because as you can tell, she really knows what she's talking about. And if you have any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions for me, those are my contact details. I would love to hear from you. Sadly, I don't get to speak to AGP clients as much as I would like. So I'm always keen to find out more about what you guys are doing and how we can help. So thank you, everyone. Really grateful to you for attending. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did, and also made me realize quite how much work I have to do with my own business. And yes, if there is anything else, then yeah, get in touch. I'll say class dismissed at this point. Lynn, if you can stick around for a few seconds afterwards, we'll catch up. But otherwise, thank you for attending, everyone. And yeah, hope to see you again at a future event. Cheers, folks.